Think you could survive medieval life? Before you answer, pause for a moment and imagine stepping back into a world so starkly different from our own. It almost feels like a different planet. No smartphones to call for help. No modern medicine to cure infections. No supermarkets to pick up food when you're hungry. No central heating to warm you through bitter winters. Just raw, unfiltered existence where every day was a battle against the elements, disease, hunger, and violence. This wasn't a time for the faint of heart. You might imagine medieval life as something romantic: knights in shining armor, grand castles, courtly love, and majestic banquets. But peel back that glossy veneer, and what you find is a harsh, unforgiving reality. Life was brutal, short, and uncertain. The majority of people lived in small villages or on rural manors, eking out a living from the soil, their fates tied to the weather and the whims of their lords. And for the average person, survival was a daily challenge that demanded grit, resourcefulness, and sometimes sheer luck. Let's start with the basics. Food. Today, when you're hungry, you grab a snack or order a meal. In medieval times, your survival depended on the success of crops and livestock. The growing season was short, and a bad harvest could mean starvation. Imagine waking up in the cold dawn, heading out to tend to crops or animals that might not even produce enough to feed you or your family. If the weather turned against you: too much rain, too little sun, early frost, your food stores would quickly dwindle and famine would loom. Starvation was common, and when it struck, it spared no one, especially the poor. Water, something we take for granted, was also a source of peril. Clean water was scarce, and contaminated sources spread diseases like cholera and dysentery, killing many. Without proper sanitation, towns and villages became breeding grounds for illness. Even something as simple as a trip to the well could be risky. People didn't understand germs or bacteria, so they had no idea how disease spread. What we now consider preventable illness was often fatal. The threat of disease wasn't just limited to waterborne illnesses. The Black Death, one of history's deadliest pandemics, wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. Entire communities vanished in months, leaving survivors to grapple with trauma and social upheaval. Medicine was primitive. Doctors used herbal remedies, bloodletting, and prayers. Surgery was crude and dangerous, often causing more harm than good. If you fell seriously ill or were injured, chances were slim that you'd recover. Now consider the physical labor that medieval life demanded. Unlike many of us today, medieval peasants and serfs didn't have machines or modern tools to ease their work. They plowed fields with wooden or iron-tipped plows, pulled by oxen or horses, harvested crops by hand with sickles, and built homes from scratch with raw materials. Their bodies were hardened by relentless toil, yet malnutrition and disease often weakened them, making the work even harder. And what about safety? Medieval life was rife with violence. Wars between kingdoms, local skirmishes, banditry, and feuds were common. If you lived in a border region or a contested area, your village could be raided and burned, your possessions stolen, your family threatened. Knights and soldiers were everywhere, but unless you were one of them or under their protection, your chances of survival during conflicts were slim. Justice was often brutal and swift, with punishments like public executions and torture being common for crimes both real and imagined. Social hierarchy also shaped your survival chances. Nobles and clergy lived very differently from peasants. The wealthiest had more access to food, shelter, and protection, while peasants lived precariously. The rigid class system meant that if you were born a peasant, you were likely to remain one, facing hardship every day with little hope of escape. But there were also moments of joy, community, and resilience. Festivals, religious holidays, and communal gatherings broke up the monotony of hard work. People told stories, sang songs, and found ways to connect despite the harshness of their reality. It was a life that demanded endurance, but also one where human spirit shone through adversity. So, could you survive medieval life? Would you have the strength, the knowledge, and the sheer will to face its challenges day after day? This isn't just about physical survival, but about navigating a world with no safety net, where every decision could mean life or death. As we dive deeper into this series, we'll explore what it really took to live and survive in the medieval world. From the struggles of food and health to the dangers of violence and the complexities of social life, prepare yourself to confront a past far tougher than you ever imagined. For the average medieval person, life revolved around the seasons, planting in spring, tending crops through summer, harvesting in the fall, and surviving the lean months of winter. The success of a harvest could mean the difference between a year of relative abundance or months of hunger and despair. Unlike today's global food supply chains, medieval communities were largely self-sufficient, relying almost exclusively on the crops and animals they raised locally. The primary staple for most medieval Europeans was bread, but it was very different from the fluffy loaves we know today. Bread was often dense and coarse, made from rye, barley, or oats mixed with wheat if available. The quality of bread varied greatly based on social class and location. Wealthier people had access to fine white wheat flour, which was lighter and more palatable. Peasants, on the other hand, often ate black bread made from less refined grains, mixed with things like bran or even ground beans to stretch their meager supplies. It was filling, but far from delicious. Bread was so central that it was sometimes referred to as the staff of life. People ate it for every meal, using it not only as food, but as an eating tool. The trencher, a thick slice of stale bread, doubled as a plate. After the meal, these bread plates were sometimes given to the poor or animals. This practice highlights how nothing was wasted when resources were limited. Beyond bread, pottages and stews were everyday fare. Pottage was a thick soup or stew made from boiling vegetables, grains, and occasionally meat or fish. The ingredients varied widely depending on what was available. Peas, beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, and root vegetables like carrots and turnips were common additions. These dishes were cooked slowly over an open fire, often flavored with herbs like parsley, thyme, or dill. Salt, when affordable, was crucial for flavor and preservation. Meat was rare for peasants and more commonly consumed by the nobility or during special occasions. Hunting rights were tightly controlled by lords, and peasants caught what they could in the form of rabbits, fish, or birds. But overhunting was punished severely. Domestic animals such as pigs, chickens, and cattle were raised more for trade, milk, or labor than for regular meat consumption. When animals were slaughtered, nearly every part was used: meat, bones for broth, and organs for offal dishes. Nothing went to waste. Preservation of food was a constant challenge. Salted and smoked meats and fish were staples for long-term storage, but these methods required skill and resources. Drying fruits and vegetables helped, but fresh produce was only available seasonally. Fruits like apples, cherries, and berries were enjoyed when in season, but had to be consumed quickly or preserved by drying or making into preserves and cider. Winter was particularly brutal. Stored grains could be ground into flour, but fresh vegetables were scarce. People relied on dried legumes, preserved foods, and whatever root vegetables had been stored in cellars or pits. This scarcity made winter a perilous time, when starvation and illness often peaked. Water, surprisingly, was often more dangerous to consume than alcohol. Wells and rivers were frequently contaminated, and without modern sanitation, disease spread easily. People drank ale or beer daily, even children, because the fermentation process killed many harmful microbes. These drinks were low in alcohol compared to today, more like a nutritious beverage. The brewing process was often done at home, especially by women, known as alewives, who played a crucial role in domestic food production. Food was tightly linked to the social order. Nobles and clergy enjoyed richer diets, including large quantities of meat, exotic spices imported from distant lands, sugar, a rare luxury, and fine wines. Feasts were opportunities to display wealth and status, with elaborate courses and entertainment. Meanwhile, peasants faced a constant battle against hunger and malnutrition, which weakened their bodies and shortened lifespans. Malnutrition was a serious problem. Vitamin deficiencies caused illnesses such as scurvy, rickets, and pellagra. Children were especially vulnerable, and infant mortality was shockingly high. The lack of variety and poor quality of diet meant that even those who survived childhood often suffered from stunted growth and chronic health problems. Despite these hardships, medieval people developed remarkable survival strategies. They cultivated hardy crops suited to their environment, rotated fields to preserve soil fertility, and shared food within communities. Religious festivals provided rare moments of abundance and joy, with special foods and communal feasting reinforcing social bonds. This deep dependence on the land and its unpredictable cycles meant that every season brought anxiety. A drought or flood, a late frost or early winter could devastate crops and livestock. When famine struck, it didn't discriminate much by class. The poor suffered the most. But even the wealthy felt the strain as prices soared and supplies dwindled. Food was more than sustenance. It was a reflection of medieval life itself, marked by hard work, vulnerability, and a constant negotiation with nature's unpredictability. Understanding this aspect of medieval survival reveals just how fragile human life was, and how deeply intertwined daily existence was with the natural world. Medieval life was a constant struggle, not just against hunger and the elements, but also against disease and poor hygiene, two of the most relentless killers of the time. To truly understand what it took to survive in those centuries, you need to grasp how fragile health was, and how ignorance and lack of resources shaped daily existence. Imagine living in a world where the very air, water, and ground around you could be deadly. Towns and villages lacked proper sanitation. Human waste, garbage, and animal droppings often mingled in streets and waterways. This created a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites that modern science hadn't yet discovered. The concept of germs was centuries away, so people had no idea how infections spread or how to prevent them. Washing wasn't a regular habit for most people. Baths were infrequent and often communal, and soap was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. In many places, bathing was thought to open the pores and let in disease rather than wash it away. People relied instead on perfumes, herbs, and ointments to mask odors and protect themselves from what they believed were bad airs or miasmas. This misunderstanding left them vulnerable to countless illnesses. Diseases like plague, smallpox, tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery ran rampant. The Black Death in the 14th century was the most catastrophic example, wiping out an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population in a matter of years. It spread quickly through fleas on rats, which thrived in filthy, crowded conditions. Entire villages were depopulated, economies collapsed, and social structures were upended. Doctors and healers of the time had very limited medical knowledge. Medicine was a mix of superstition, herbal remedies, and religious faith. Treatments often did more harm than good bloodletting, for example, was widely practiced, where patients were drained of blood to balance humors, but it weakened them further. Surgery was rudimentary and painful, with no anesthesia and a high risk of infection. Childbirth was another deadly risk for women. Maternal mortality was high, and many children did not survive infancy. Midwives provided care, but without sterile conditions or proper medical tools, complications were often fatal. Despite these risks, families were large, as high birth rates were necessary to offset high mortality. Nutrition and health were deeply intertwined. Poor diets weakened immune systems, making people more susceptible to disease. Malnutrition was widespread, especially among peasants who had little access to protein and fresh food. Deficiencies caused conditions like scurvy, rickets, and anemia, all of which impaired physical strength and stamina. Mental health was also affected by the harsh realities of medieval life. Constant fear of war, famine, disease, and social instability created stress and trauma, though medieval societies lacked the frameworks to understand or treat psychological conditions. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval people developed their own ways to cope. Herbal medicine was sophisticated in some respects, with remedies derived from plants like willow bark, a precursor to aspirin, and garlic. Religious rituals and prayers were believed to provide protection and healing. Hygiene improved somewhat in monasteries and wealthy households, where knowledge and resources were greater. Understanding the precariousness of medieval health is key to appreciating just how difficult survival was. Every cough, every cut, every illness carried a real threat of death, and the absence of modern medicine meant that even minor injuries could turn fatal. Life in the medieval period was shaped not only by the brutal demands of survival, but also by a rigid and deeply entrenched social hierarchy. This structure influenced every aspect of a person's daily existence, from their occupation and living conditions to their rights, privileges, and responsibilities. To understand whether someone could survive medieval life, it's essential to grasp how this social system worked and how it impacted people's chances. At the top of the hierarchy stood the monarch king or queen, who ruled over vast territories. Their authority was often justified by divine right, the belief that their power was granted by God. Below the monarch were the nobles, including dukes, earls, barons, and knights. These individuals controlled large swaths of land and wealth, held military power, and played key roles in governance and justice. They lived lives of relative comfort, with grand castles or manors, servants, and access to fine food and clothing. The clergy formed another elite group, wielding immense spiritual influence and often significant temporal power. Bishops, abbots, and priests managed the church's vast properties and acted as mediators between the divine and the people. The church was a central institution in medieval life, shaping culture, education, and morality. Most people, however, were peasants or serfs who worked the land. Serfs were legally bound to the estates they lived on, unable to leave without their lord's permission. Peasants might have more freedom, but still faced heavy taxes and labor obligations. Their lives revolved around farming, animal husbandry, and crafts necessary for daily survival. They lived in small villages, often in simple one-room homes made from wood, wattle, and daub. Within this social framework, everyone had a defined role, and social mobility was extremely limited. The idea of rising from a peasant to a noble was practically impossible. Birth largely determined your destiny. Daily life was shaped by this order. Nobles trained for warfare, managed estates, and held court. Peasants worked from dawn till dusk, tending crops, repairing fences, and fulfilling obligations to their lords. Women's roles varied, but were generally centered on household duties, child-rearing, and sometimes labor in the fields or crafts. Children helped from a young age, learning the skills needed to sustain their families. Community was vital. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and market days broke the monotony and reinforced social bonds. Despite hardships, people found ways to celebrate, socialize, and support each other. Understanding medieval social structure reveals how survival was not only a matter of physical endurance, but also navigating a complex web of obligations, protections, and power relations. Warfare in medieval times was not just an occasional event, but a defining feature of the era. It permeated every aspect of life, from the architecture of villages to the very economy of kingdoms. For most people, the fear of raids, invasions, and local conflicts was a constant shadow, influencing how they lived, worked, and even what they believed. At the core of medieval warfare was the knight, a heavily armored cavalryman whose training often began in childhood. Becoming a knight required years of dedication, physical training, and learning the arts of horsemanship and combat. Knights wore chainmail or plate armor that could weigh anywhere from 30 to 60 pounds, designed to protect vital areas while still allowing some mobility. Their weapons included swords, lances, maces, and axes, each suited for different fighting styles. Knights were the elite fighters on the battlefield, but their role extended beyond combat. They were also landowners, administrators, and symbols of feudal power. Below the knights were foot soldiers, many of whom were peasants conscripted into military service. These men typically lacked formal training and fought with simpler weapons like spears, bows, and clubs. The use of archers was particularly important, as they could strike from a distance and disrupt enemy formations. Longbows, especially famous in English armies, could penetrate armor and change the course of battles like Agincourt in 1415. Castles were the linchpins of medieval defense strategies. These structures were designed not just as homes, but as fortresses that could withstand prolonged assaults. Early castles were often wooden motte and bailey designs, but over time, stone keeps with thick walls and towers became standard. Features such as moats, water-filled ditches surrounding the castle drawbridges, murder holes, and arrow slits were all innovations aimed at repelling attackers. Living inside a castle offered protection, but also meant living in a militarized environment, constantly prepared for siege or attack. Sieges were among the most brutal aspects of medieval warfare. Instead of direct combat, attackers would encircle a castle or fortified town, cutting off supplies and waiting for defenders to weaken. Starvation, disease, and psychological stress often caused defenders to surrender without a fight. Siege engines like trebuchets hurled massive stones to batter walls, while battering rams and siege towers helped attackers breach defenses. Defenders countered with boiling oil, arrows, and strategic sorties to disrupt attackers' plans. Warfare disrupted everyday life in profound ways. When armies marched, they needed food and shelter, often taking these by force from local populations. Crops were trampled, livestock stolen, and homes burned. This destruction caused famine, displacement, and poverty. For peasants, the arrival of war could mean losing everything and being forced to flee or join an army. Feudal obligations meant that lords had to provide military service to their king, which could strain their resources and those of their vassals. Nobles were responsible for raising troops from their lands and equipping them for battle, which was expensive and time-consuming. This system sometimes led to fragmented authority and rivalries that fueled further conflicts. Despite the brutality, medieval warfare was guided by a complex set of unwritten rules and customs. The code of chivalry idealized honor, bravery, and respect for opponents. Though in practice, these ideals were often compromised. Jousting tournaments allowed knights to practice combat skills and gain prestige without the deadly risks of real battle. These events also reinforced social hierarchies and provided entertainment. The impact of warfare extended beyond the battlefield. It influenced art, literature, and religion, with stories of heroic knights and tragic battles shaping the medieval imagination. Monasteries and churches often became refuges during conflicts, but they were not immune to violence either. Understanding warfare in medieval life reveals a world where conflict was constant and survival depended on more than just physical strength. It required political savvy, strong alliances, and the ability to adapt to ever-changing threats. For ordinary people, the hope of peace was often fragile, and their lives were shaped by the outcome of battles they could neither avoid nor influence. Medieval housing and living conditions were a direct reflection of one's social status, environment, and the harsh realities of the era. Survival wasn't just about food and safety from war. It was also deeply influenced by where and how people lived. From the grand stone castles of the nobility to the humble huts of peasants, medieval homes shaped daily life, health, and even social relationships. For the vast majority, the peasants, their homes were simple and practical, built with whatever materials were locally available. Most villages consisted of small cottages, made from wood, wattle, and daub, a mixture of woven wooden strips covered with a combination of clay, straw, and manure, and thatched roofs. These houses were often a single room that served multiple purposes: cooking, eating, sleeping, and sometimes housing livestock at night for warmth and protection. Inside, the space was dark and smoky. Open hearths provided heat and a place to cook, but filled the room with smoke, as chimneys were rare before the late Middle Ages. The floors were often just packed earth or simple wooden planks, and furniture was sparse basic benches, stools, and a simple table. Beds were rudimentary, usually just a straw mattress or rushes spread on the floor, shared by the entire family. Sanitation was minimal or non-existent. Waste disposal was primitive, with people often using chamber pots emptied into the streets or nearby rivers. This lack of hygiene contributed to the spread of disease and pests. Privacy was a luxury almost unheard of in peasant homes, where families lived closely together and many villagers shared communal spaces. The peasants' relationship with their homes was also tied to their work. Many cottages had small plots of land for growing vegetables, herbs, or keeping chickens and pigs. The home was a center of labor as much as rest. In contrast, noble residences were designed for defense, status, and comfort. Castles were not just military fortresses. They were the homes of lords, their families, and retainers. Early castles were often wooden motte and bailey constructions, but by the later medieval period, stone keeps and concentric castles with multiple layers of walls and towers became common. Inside castles, rooms were larger and more varied. Great halls served as dining and meeting spaces. Private chambers offered some comfort, and chapels catered to spiritual needs. While cold and drafty by modern standards, castles featured fireplaces, tapestries to insulate walls, and sometimes glass windows, luxuries unavailable to common folk. Manor houses, the homes of lesser nobles or wealthy peasants, were simpler but still more comfortable than peasant cottages. They often combined living quarters with spaces for managing estate affairs. In towns and cities, housing was denser and often cramped. Wooden structures leaned over narrow cobblestone streets, creating a maze of alleys. Fire was a constant danger in these crowded quarters, and diseases spread quickly through poor sanitation. Seasonal weather played a big role in living conditions. Winters were cold and harsh, with limited heating. People wore heavy clothing indoors and huddled close to fires. Food stores had to last through the winter months, and the risk of starvation loomed if supplies ran low. Lighting was minimal. Candles, rushlights, or oil lamps provided flickering illumination after sunset. The long hours of darkness influenced daily routines, with much activity centered around daylight. Despite their hardships, medieval people adapted their homes and lifestyles to survive. They used natural materials, recycled resources, and developed communal practices for maintenance and safety. Villages often had common areas like wells, ovens, and grazing lands shared among residents. Understanding medieval housing offers a vivid window into everyday struggles and comforts, revealing how people made do with limited means and found ways to create a sense of home amid uncertainty. Clothing in medieval times was far more than just a means to cover the body. It was a vivid indicator of social status, profession, and identity. The type of fabric, the colors worn, and the styles varied drastically depending on whether one was a noble, a merchant, a craftsman, or a peasant. Understanding medieval clothing and personal care sheds light on daily life challenges and the practicalities of survival in an era without modern conveniences. For the average peasant, clothing was simple and utilitarian. Wool, was the most common fabric, chosen for its warmth and durability. Linen, made from flax, was used for undergarments and shirts because of its comfort against the skin. Most peasants wore garments they or their families made at home: tunics, simple dresses, cloaks and hose, tight-fitting leg coverings. Clothing was generally undyed or dyed with natural substances that yielded muted colors like browns, greens, and dull yellows. Nobles, on the other hand, wore finer fabrics such as silk, velvet, and brocade, often richly dyed in vibrant hues like deep reds, blues, and purples. These colors were expensive to produce and, in many places, legally restricted to the upper classes through sumptuary laws. Elaborate embroidery, fur trims, and jewelry adorned their clothing to display wealth and power. Both men and women wore multiple layers for warmth and fashion. Men typically wore a linen shirt, a woolen tunic, hose, and sometimes a surcoat or cloak. Women's dress included a chemise, a linen underdress, an overdress, and a mantle or cloak. Head coverings were common. Men wore hats or hoods, while women's styles ranged from simple veils to intricate wimples and hennons, tall, pointed hats. Clothing was expensive and labor-intensive to produce. Textiles had to be spun and woven by hand, and dyes were extracted from plants, insects, or minerals through long processes. This meant that garments were precious and often repaired and reused for years. When clothes wore out, parts might be salvaged or given to poorer family members. Personal hygiene in medieval times was limited compared to modern standards, but still important. Baths were infrequent for most, and people used wash basins to clean their faces and hands regularly. Soap was available but costly, and often reserved for the wealthy. Herbal infusions, perfumes, and scented gloves helped mask odors. Hair care varied, with men and women usually keeping their hair covered in public for modesty and protection from the elements. Barbers not only cut hair, but often acted as surgeons, performing minor medical procedures. Teeth cleaning was rudimentary. People used cloths, fingers, or chew sticks from aromatic trees to freshen breath. Dental health was poor overall, with many suffering from cavities and tooth loss. Nail care was basic, but cleanliness was valued as a sign of civility. Clothing and grooming helped signal one's social role, as slovenliness could result in social stigma or even legal penalties. Understanding clothing and personal care reveals how medieval people balanced practicality, social norms, and identity, each garment and daily ritual contributing to their survival in a demanding world. Education in medieval times was a complex and layered institution, deeply intertwined with religion, social hierarchy, and cultural norms. The very concept of formal education, as we understand it today, was nascent and reserved for a small elite. The majority of people lived their lives without ever learning to read or write, relying instead on oral traditions, apprenticeships, and religious instruction to navigate their world. The primary centers of education were the monasteries, where monks devoted themselves to prayer, manuscript copying, and scholarly study. These religious communities became the guardians of knowledge during what is sometimes called the Dark Ages, preserving not only Christian texts, but also classical works of philosophy, science, and literature. Monastic schools offered instruction in the liberal arts, which were divided into the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This curriculum laid the foundation for intellectual inquiry and was primarily accessible to those pursuing religious vocations. Cathedral schools emerged in the later Middle Ages, often attached to large churches or cathedrals. They provided education for clerics, and sometimes the sons of nobles or wealthy merchants. These schools focused on teaching Latin, which was the lingua franca of the church, law, and international scholarship. Mastery of Latin was essential for anyone aspiring to advance in clerical or administrative roles. Universities, which began to appear in the 12th and 13th centuries, marked a significant development in medieval education. Institutions such as the University of Bologna, the University of Paris, and Oxford University became centers of advanced learning. The university system formalized degrees, courses, and examinations, offering instruction in theology, canon law, civil law, medicine, and the arts. However, access was still limited mainly to men from privileged backgrounds, and tuition was expensive. The curriculum remained rooted in the Church's influence, with theology considered the queen of the sciences. For the vast majority of the population, education took place outside formal institutions. Peasant children learned practical skills essential to rural life, such as farming, animal husbandry, woodworking, and household management, through family and community apprenticeship. Girls were primarily educated in domestic skills, such as spinning, weaving, cooking, and childcare, preparing them for roles as wives and mothers. Literacy was generally not expected or necessary for their survival. The social implications of literacy were profound. Being able to read and write granted individuals access to legal rights, economic opportunities, and social mobility. However, this privilege was often tightly controlled by the elite, perpetuating power structures. Official documents, such as land deeds, contracts, and laws, were recorded and interpreted by clerks and priests, who held a monopoly on literacy. Oral culture played an essential role in medieval life, especially for those who could not read. Stories, songs, and sermons were primary means of conveying history, morality, and communal values. The performance of troubadours, minstrels, and bards kept alive a rich tradition of storytelling that complemented the written word. Religious plays and festivals also educated the populace in biblical stories and Christian doctrine. The gradual rise of vernacular languages in literature and scholarship during the later Middle Ages, works by Dante, Chaucer, and others helped broaden educational access beyond Latin literate elites. This cultural shift contributed to increasing literacy rates and the eventual spread of printed books after the invention of the printing press. Medieval education was not only about knowledge acquisition, but also about inculcating religious faith, moral discipline, and social order. Church teachings were central to all forms of education, with catechism and prayer forming the core of instruction for both clergy and lay people. In conclusion, while education and literacy in the medieval period were restricted and unevenly distributed, they were foundational in shaping the intellectual, social, and religious landscape of the time. Survival and success often hinged on one's ability to navigate this educational hierarchy, whether through formal schooling or practical skills learned within one's community. Religion was the heartbeat of medieval life, permeating every aspect of existence from birth to death. In a world often marked by uncertainty, hardship, and constant threat of war or famine, faith provided a framework for understanding life, the cosmos, and one's place within it. Christianity dominated Western Europe during the medieval period, shaping cultural norms, laws, education, art, and even governance. To survive medieval life was, in many ways, to live a life deeply intertwined with religion. The Church was the most powerful institution of the time, wielding immense influence over kings and peasants alike. It was not only a spiritual authority, but also a political and economic powerhouse. The Pope and the clergy had the ability to crown kings, levy taxes such as tithes, and enforce moral codes through mechanisms like excommunication or interdict. Local parish churches formed the center of community life, where villagers gathered not just for worship, but also for social events and the exchange of news. Faith shaped daily routines. Medieval people observed a calendar punctuated by religious festivals, holy days, and saints' feast days. Lent and Advent were times of fasting and reflection, while Easter and Christmas celebrated the core events of Christian belief. Pilgrimages to holy sites such as Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem were acts of devotion and penitence, sometimes undertaken for miraculous healing or spiritual merit. The sacraments baptism, communion, confession, marriage, and last rites marked significant life transitions and were believed essential for salvation. Religious education began early, with children taught prayers, hymns, and biblical stories, often through visual aids like stained glass windows and church murals. Monasteries and convents were vital centers of spiritual life. Monks and nuns followed strict rules of prayer, work, and study, dedicating themselves to a life of contemplation and service. These religious houses also acted as places of charity, education, and medical care, offering refuge and assistance to travelers, the poor, and the sick. Mysticism and popular piety flourished alongside official doctrine. People sought personal experiences of the divine through visions, relics, and miracles. Saints were revered, and their relics, bones, clothing, or objects associated with them were believed to hold miraculous powers. Pilgrims often sought these relics for healing or protection. Religious art and architecture were expressions of faith and social status. The soaring cathedrals, with their intricate stained glass, soaring vaults, and sculptures, were meant to inspire awe and bring worshippers closer to God. The medieval imagination was steeped in biblical symbolism, with stories from the Bible depicted vividly in frescoes, tapestries, and illuminated manuscripts. However, the Church's immense power was not without controversy. Corruption, such as the selling of indulgences or abuses of clerical authority, led to growing dissatisfaction and movements for reform. Heresies and dissenting beliefs were often harshly suppressed, with the Inquisition acting to root out what was seen as dangerous deviation from orthodoxy. For ordinary people, faith was both a comfort and a source of fear of sin, hell, and divine judgment. The promise of paradise and eternal life provided hope amid suffering, while the rituals and prayers offered a sense of control in an unpredictable world. Understanding medieval religion reveals a society where spiritual and temporal realms were inseparable. Survival depended not only on physical endurance, but on maintaining a right relationship with God and the Church. In medieval Europe, the approach to medicine was as much a social and spiritual endeavor as it was a physical one. Illness was often viewed through a religious lens. It was seen as a punishment from God for sin or as a test of faith. This belief influenced how people responded to sickness and injury, often turning first to prayer, confession, and pilgrimage before seeking physical remedies. The role of clergy in healthcare was significant. Monasteries not only served as centers of spiritual life, but also as places of healing. Monks and nuns tended to the sick, blending religious rituals with herbal remedies. Many monasteries maintained herb gardens, cultivating medicinal plants believed to possess healing properties. The preparation of these herbal medicines was meticulous, with monks recording recipes and treatments in manuscripts that formed the basis of medieval pharmacology. Herbal medicine was the cornerstone of medieval healthcare for most people. Plants such as rosemary, lavender, sage, and mint were prized not just for their aromatic qualities, but for their perceived therapeutic effects. Willow bark, for example, contains salicin, a natural compound related to aspirin, which helped reduce pain and fever. Garlic was used for its antiseptic qualities, while chamomile was thought to soothe digestive ailments. These remedies were accessible to peasants and often formed the first line of defense against illness. Physicians in medieval times were often university educated and followed the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates. Their treatments were heavily influenced by the theory of the four humors. For example, if a patient had a fever, it was believed that too much blood or yellow bile was present. The physician might order bloodletting to restore balance. Bloodletting was performed using leeches or by making small incisions with lancets. Though painful and risky, it was one of the most common medical procedures of the era. Surgery was a separate and somewhat less prestigious branch of medicine, usually handled by barber surgeons. These practitioners performed a range of operations, from setting broken bones to amputations and dental extractions. Given the lack of anesthesia and sterilization, surgeries were dangerous, often leading to infections and death. Yet, their work was essential, especially during times of war when battlefield injuries were common. Midwives held an essential role in medieval communities. Childbirth was fraught with danger for both mother and infant, with high mortality rates. Midwives not only assisted in deliveries, but also provided care and advice on women's health issues. Their knowledge was typically passed down through generations, rooted in practical experience and herbal lore. Despite their vital role, midwives were often viewed with suspicion by the male-dominated medical establishment and the church, especially if outcomes were poor. The plague, or Black Death, was the most catastrophic health crisis of the medieval period, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. The disease spread rapidly through flea bites carried by rats, but the cause was unknown at the time. People attributed the plague to divine punishment, miasmas, bad air, or conspiracy theories. Responses included mass prayers, processions, and the persecution of minority groups scapegoated for the calamity. Sanitation was rudimentary. Most people lived in cramped conditions with little access to clean water. Waste was often disposed of in streets or rivers, which contributed to the spread of diseases like dysentery and cholera. Bathing was infrequent, partly due to cultural attitudes that associated water with vulnerability to illness, and partly because of the scarcity of heated water or bathing facilities. Public bathhouses existed, but declined over time, especially after outbreaks of plague. Diet and nutrition also impacted health. The diet of peasants was largely based on bread, pottage, a thick stew, vegetables, and occasionally meat or fish. Nutritional deficiencies were common, leading to conditions like scurvy or rickets. Nobles enjoyed a more varied diet, including rich meats, spices, and imported delicacies, though overindulgence could also lead to health problems. Medieval medicine was a balancing act between limited scientific knowledge and deep-rooted cultural and religious beliefs. Despite its limitations, it formed a crucial part of life, with people adapting as best they could to the ever-present threats of disease and injury. The training of a knight began early in childhood, often around the age of 7, when a boy from a noble family was sent away to live in another lord's castle as a page. This was the first step in a rigorous and lifelong preparation to become a mounted warrior of the highest status. The page learned the basics of courtly behavior, horse care, and weapon handling. By his early teens, he advanced to the rank of squire, serving a knight directly. As a squire, his responsibilities increased, including caring for the knight's armor and weapons, accompanying him into battle, and learning the art of combat firsthand. Knighthood was not just about fighting. It was steeped in ideals known as chivalry. This code emphasized loyalty, bravery, honor, and courtesy, particularly toward women and the weak. While often romanticized, in reality, knights were also ruthless fighters who played crucial roles in military campaigns and local enforcement of their lord's will. Armor was a knight's lifeline and status symbol. Early medieval warriors wore chainmail, a flexible mesh of interlinked metal rings that offered protection while allowing movement. Over time, plate armor became prevalent, covering the body in rigid metal plates designed to deflect sword blows and arrows. This armor could weigh upwards of 50 pounds but was expertly balanced. A knight in full armor, mounted on a war horse, also protected by barding armor for horses, was a fearsome sight. Weapons varied, from the ubiquitous sword, often a family heirloom forged by skilled blacksmiths, to lances, maces, and battle axes. The lance was the weapon of choice during a cavalry charge, designed to strike with devastating force. Close combat might involve swords and daggers, while siege engineers developed tools to assault fortifications. Castles were masterpieces of military architecture and served as power centers. Their design evolved to counter new offensive tactics. Early wooden motte and bailey castles gave way to stone keeps with thick curtain walls. Features like arrow slits allowed defenders to fire while remaining protected. Murder holes above gates let defenders pour boiling oil or rocks on attackers. Moats added a watery barrier to slow assaults. Siege, warfare, tested the patience and ingenuity of both attackers and defenders. Attackers used siege towers to scale walls, battering rams to break gates, and trebuchets or catapults to hurl stones or flaming projectiles. Defenders countered with pouring hot liquids, shooting arrows, and even psychological tactics like false retreats or signaling for reinforcements. A prolonged siege could last months, wearing down supplies and morale. Beyond the battlefield, warfare influenced medieval society profoundly. It shaped land ownership through conquest and rewarded loyal service with grants of land or titles. Nobles built castles to protect their estates and assert authority. The constant threat of conflict fostered a culture of preparedness, with communities organized to support defense, from local militias to watchtowers. However, war also brought devastation. Raids and pillaging destroyed crops and homes, causing famine and displacement. The economic burden of raising armies was heavy, often leading to increased taxes or forced labor. For peasants, survival often meant submission or flight. The Crusades epitomize medieval warfare's religious dimension. These holy wars, launched to reclaim the Holy Land, involved knights and armies from across Europe. Crusading was seen as a sacred duty, offering spiritual rewards like indulgences and the promise of heaven. Yet, these campaigns also unleashed brutality, complex politics, and long-lasting cultural exchanges. Medieval warfare was not static. It evolved with changing technology, tactics, and political landscapes. The introduction of gunpowder weapons in the later Middle Ages began to render castles vulnerable and shift the nature of combat, setting the stage for the eventual decline of the knight's dominance. To truly understand medieval survival, one must grasp the omnipresence of warfare and defense, a constant, shaping force in every life, from king to peasant. Life in the medieval period was deeply shaped by a rigid social hierarchy that dictated a person's role, rights, and responsibilities. Unlike today's societies, where social mobility is more attainable, medieval life was largely defined by birth. The social order was divided mainly into three estates: those who prayed, the clergy; those who fought, the nobility; and those who worked, the peasants and serfs. Each estate had distinct duties and expectations, and understanding these relationships is key to grasping how people survived and interacted in this complex society. At the top of the social pyramid stood the monarch king or queen, who ruled by divine right, believed to be chosen by God to govern the land. The monarch's power, while immense, was balanced by the influence of nobles and the church. The king's court was not only a political center, but a cultural hub, where nobles gathered for council, festivities, and the display of wealth and power. Beneath the monarch were the nobles, including dukes, earls, barons, and knights. They held lands granted by the king and had the responsibility to protect their territories and maintain order. Nobles lived in castles or manor houses, which served as administrative centers and homes. Their wealth came primarily from the labor of peasants on their lands, who paid rents, taxes, or provided services. Knights occupied a special place among the nobility. They were warriors trained to fight and uphold the code of chivalry, an idealized set of moral and social rules, emphasizing honor, loyalty, and protection of the weak. Knights could also serve as administrators or judges within their lord's domain. Training to become a knight began in childhood, and their status was often inherited. The clergy formed another powerful estate. The church was the largest landowner in medieval Europe, and its leaders, bishops, abbots, and the Pope exercised considerable spiritual and temporal authority. Parish priests were the most common clergy members, serving the religious needs of local communities. Monks and nuns lived in monastic communities, dedicating their lives to prayer, education, and care for the sick and poor. Most of the population were peasants and serfs who worked the land. Peasants were free but economically dependent on their lords, while serfs were bound to the land, unable to leave without permission. Their daily lives were hard, marked by long hours of manual labor, simple diets, and few comforts. Yet, they formed the backbone of medieval society, producing the food and goods necessary for survival. Social interactions were governed by customs and expectations tied to one's estate. Nobles socialized mainly among themselves, engaging in tournaments, feasts, and political alliances through marriage. The clergy connected across regions through the church's hierarchy and religious festivals. Peasants formed tight-knit village communities, often centered around the local church and market. Feudal obligations created a network of loyalty and duty. Vassals pledged service to their lords, who in turn provided protection and land. This system was not static. It involved negotiations, conflicts, and adaptations over time. Disputes were common, but often resolved through legal mechanisms or mediation by the church. Daily life was also punctuated by festivals, fairs, and religious observances that brought people together, offering respite from labor and reinforcing social bonds. Markets and trade fairs facilitated not only economic exchange, but also the spread of news, ideas, and culture. Understanding medieval social structures reveals a society where survival depended on knowing one's place, fulfilling duties, and navigating a world where every interaction was shaped by status and tradition. Medieval cuisine was as much about necessity as it was about culture and survival. The daily routine of preparing and consuming food reflected the rhythms of agricultural life, religious observances, and social status. Kitchens in medieval homes varied greatly, from simple hearths in peasant cottages to expansive, bustling kitchens in noble castles, staffed by numerous servants and cooks. The availability of ingredients and methods of preparation revealed much about a person's place in society and their ability to endure the challenges of the era. At the heart of medieval nutrition for common folk was the reliance on grains, which provided the bulk of calories. Barley and rye were more common in northern Europe due to their hardiness in colder climates, while wheat was preferred, but more expensive and less widely accessible. Milling grain was a crucial and labor-intensive process, often controlled by local lords who owned mills and charged fees for their use, creating an economic layer to even basic food production. Pottage, the ubiquitous stew, was a versatile dish. It was typically made by boiling vegetables such as onions, cabbage, carrots, peas, beans, and herbs in water or broth. Occasionally, bits of bacon or salted pork would be added for flavor. The consistency could range from thick to thin, depending on the ingredients and how much water was used. Pottage could be eaten with bread or alone, and was often reheated and eaten over several days. It was a humble but nourishing meal, and its simplicity masked the skill needed to balance flavors and nutrients. Vegetables played a crucial role in the peasant diet, but they were often seasonal and dependent on what could be grown in local gardens or foraged from the wild. Root vegetables, such as turnips, parsnips, and onions, were staples, as they stored well over winter. Legumes like peas and beans provided essential proteins and helped replenish soil nitrogen through crop rotation practices. Meat consumption was heavily regulated by social and religious rules. Hunting rights, as mentioned before, were reserved for the aristocracy, and commoners caught small game or kept a few animals for their own use. The church calendar imposed numerous fasting days, where meat and dairy were prohibited, and fish became the primary source of protein. These fasts punctuated the year, influencing eating habits and driving demand for preserved fish, such as salted cod or dried herring. Fish also had symbolic and economic significance. Coastal and river communities depended heavily on fishing, and fishmongers formed an important part of medieval towns. In urban markets, fish was sold fresh, salted, or dried, catering to both the poor and wealthy. Special fish dishes featured in noble banquets, sometimes prepared with elaborate sauces or spices, reflecting the culinary sophistication of the upper classes. Speaking of spices, the medieval period saw a dramatic increase in the importation and use of exotic spices like black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron. These spices were transported from Asia via complex trade routes, often passing through multiple hands before reaching Europe. They were incredibly expensive, used sparingly in cooking, and served as a marker of wealth and prestige. Nobles sprinkled spices over meat dishes to mask less fresh flavors, or simply to flaunt their status. Honey was the primary sweetener before sugar became widespread, and it was used in cooking and baking. Mead, an alcoholic beverage made from fermented honey and water, was also popular among all social classes. Preservation of food was vital, especially given the lack of refrigeration. Salting and smoking meat and fish extended shelf life and allowed storage through winter or for long journeys. Pickling vegetables in vinegar or brine helped maintain supplies of essential nutrients when fresh produce was unavailable. Root cellars and cool, dark storage areas were common methods to keep food edible. Feasting was an important social and political act among the nobility. Banquets displayed wealth and power, with tables groaning under roasted meats, pies, fresh breads, and delicate pastries. Entertainment, such as minstrels, jesters, and dancers, accompanied these meals, turning them into events of spectacle and celebration. The elaborate rules of etiquette observed at these gatherings further reinforced social hierarchies. Despite the apparent simplicity of peasant diets, the medieval era saw a surprising variety of foods and culinary traditions. Cookbooks from the time, like Le Viandier and The Form of Curie, reveal sophisticated recipes and techniques that challenge the stereotype of medieval food as bland or monotonous. However, malnutrition remained a serious issue, particularly among the lower classes. Deficiencies in vitamins, especially vitamin C and D, caused diseases like scurvy and rickets. Famine, often triggered by poor harvests, war, or disease, could decimate populations and cause social unrest. Survival in the medieval era was a constant test of endurance and adaptation. Unlike today, where technology and infrastructure shield us from many hardships, medieval people lived with the ever-present threat of famine, disease, war, and harsh weather. Each day was shaped by the necessities of securing food, shelter, and safety. The land itself was both a provider and a challenge, demanding respect and hard labor. The social fabric of medieval life was woven tightly with duty and hierarchy. From the king to the lowest serf, everyone had a role that both defined their existence and limited their freedom. A peasant's survival depended on the lord's favor and the success of crops, while nobles had to balance warfare, governance, and social expectation. For both, survival was a precarious balancing act. One cannot talk about medieval survival without acknowledging the role of the church. Faith permeated every aspect of life, offering comfort and community, but also shaping laws and social norms. Religious festivals provided rhythm to the year, breaking up long periods of toil with celebration and reflection. Healthcare was rudimentary, and medical knowledge limited. Many relied on herbal remedies, folk wisdom, and the prayers of clergy. Epidemics like the Black Death devastated populations, yet communities rebuilt and adapted. This resilience speaks volumes about the human spirit in the face of adversity. Medieval warfare, a backdrop to much of this era, was brutal and relentless. Knights and soldiers fought with honor and ferocity, but battles also meant death for countless ordinary people caught in the crossfire. Castles and fortifications were symbols of power, but also refuges for the vulnerable. Despite hardships, medieval life was not devoid of joy, creativity, or progress. Art, literature, music, and architecture flourished. Communities gathered in markets and fairs, fostering trade and cultural exchange. The groundwork laid during this time would influence centuries to come. As we reflect on what it took to survive medieval life, the answer emerges clearly. It was not just physical strength or combat skill, but an intricate web of social ties, faith, knowledge, and sheer perseverance. Survival meant understanding one's place in the world and making the most of limited resources, while navigating the uncertainties of the time. In today's world, the medieval period might seem distant and alien. Yet, the echoes of its challenges and triumphs remain. The medieval mindset, its struggles, beliefs, and structures help us appreciate the progress humanity has made and the enduring qualities that define us.